Okay, so I mean, it's always easier to not to be the first one to speak. So to this extent, I will try to rebound on what was said in the previous panel first, maybe very quickly. Just a first comment about the Gilets jaunes and what I believe makes sense. And I think it was said earlier, which is, in order for carbon pricing and climate to succeed, the majority needs to be on the street to fight for climate. And the majority are the poorest, unfortunately. So the poorest need to be on the street to fight for climate. To this extent, we need absolutely to fight, and I think as corporates and some of the initiatives that have been launched in the US, mentioned by Paul in particular, go to this direction. We need to fight for a redistribution. First of all, carbon neutral taxes, and secondly, a redistribution towards the poorest, so as we don't repeat the mistake that has been made in France, and the poorest receive more than what they spend, which at the end of the day will push them on the street to ask for a carbon tax or a carbon incentive. And I think this is very critical wherever we are, whether it is in Europe, in the US, in Africa, or anywhere else. And the way the things are structured is, A, it has to go to the poorest, B, and I think the point was made earlier, it is good to define a carbon tax or a carbon incentive, but at the same time, the use of proceeds need to be explained, and the use of proceeds needs to be explained more than the way it is calculated. The use of proceeds is just critical. And I must confess, I have not always had that opinion. I changed on this. Because at the very beginning, I was of the view, which was described by Connie earlier, which was that I was of the view that the bulk of the proceeds should be redistributed to corporates, whether it are the same or others, in order for these corporates to accelerate innovation, R&D, investment in low-carbon businesses. And this is a theoretical, probably good view, but it's not a practical or a societal good view. And I think that at the end of the day, the bulk should be redistributed to the poorest, and yes, still a part should be directed towards innovation, R&D, and so on, but not the bulk.
What made you change your mind?
Time.
Time?
Time. Just time, and looking at what works and what doesn't work. And you know what? To this extent, I have been wrong. Yeah. And I think that's very important. And we all change on this dimension.
Can I just ask you a quick question about that? Because in the, you know, we both sat in boardrooms, and I'm just thinking that that point of view, speaking as a corporate, that there needs to be some way of giving an incentive towards low carbon and giving the proceeds to the poorest is not something that I've often heard other corporate leaders saying.
But you know, to this extent, the initiative, the US initiative that has been highlighted by Paul, is in that spirit, which is redistributing the proceeds of any carbon tax or carbon incentive to society. Yeah. I think it could go one step further, which is to describe how it is redistributed to society. And I think it should be redistributed to society in such a manner that the greatest number wants to be on the street to ask for a carbon tax or a carbon incentive. Yeah. That's practicality. The two other points I would like to make are the following, and they are still about money. And unfortunately, humankind is about money to some extent, about ego, about this type of stuff. Making sure that executive pay be linked to CO2 emission reduction is incredibly powerful. Incredibly powerful to align corporations on and align everybody within corporations on climate.
Yeah.
And some companies have already done that, and I really hope that many more will do that. And generally, that linked to the second point, leadership, egos, and so on go together. And when one company does something, the another one does something. You know, the first who does it is maverick. The second who does it is very smart. The third who does it, so. And you always have to look at this type of thing: the leader, the first follower, the second follower. And here in the oil and gas industry, in the energy industry, we are on this particular domain. We are about to succeed because there was a leader, there was a first follower, there is a second follower, and so on. It will work. The third point is still about money, is investors. Investors have an incredible role to play, and what Paul told us yesterday about BP supporting an investor resolution on climate change is just critical. And in fact, we must push those who have the money to push those who invest to, I would say, do the right things and better things. Because those who have the money have the power. Unfortunately, still the same thing.
Yeah.
Still the same topic.
So this point about KPIs, executive pay linking to CO2 reduction, I think could be hugely important and is already starting to take hold, isn't it? And so let's really highlight that one as a connection in a way between what we were talking about earlier, what we're talking about now, but also the link between business and finance. I think, and the investors that I've been speaking to, there is quite an argument about the oil and gas industry that says they have profited from creating the problem, they should be paying for the solution. I was speaking to one asset manager who said they didn't get the money from it, we own them, so we got the money. And because we're institutional investors and you have a pension, it means you got the money. So there's actually a spread of responsibility and benefit as well as a spread of gain.
Yesterday there was something very nice that was shown to us. Our friends from Timothy from Thomson Reuters has shown us that there was a direct correlation between value creation and decarbonization of businesses. And I have a comment to this, which I agree and I disagree. For me, there is a direct correlation between decarbonation and a long-term vision with short-term business implications. And leaders who have a long-term vision that is right with short-term business implications create more value than others. And in the 21st century, I cannot see any long-term vision with short-term business implication which is not correlated and linked to decarbonation. Hence the correlation. So it's not about decarbonation, it's about vision with business implication.
In what way do you disagree then?
Because the correlation is not between decarbonation and value creation.
Yeah.
It's about vision and value creation.
Got it.
And vision implies decarbonation today.
Got it. I'm sure we're going to come back to that point as well. So thanks very much, Jérôme. We'll move on to Bjørn Haugland from DNVGL. What's your barrier to action in the corporate sphere?
Yeah, so I think, yesterday Georg kind of reminded us that this challenge of climate change is probably the biggest challenge we have been up to. And it is about a transformation. It's not only about an energy transformation, it's basically a societal transformation involving all of us. And that is not easy to point on specific members who need to take, a particular role, but we are all involved. And I think coming back to the corporation and the business sector, for me, the main barrier now in order to accelerate even more is leadership and the culture we build into our corporation. And honestly speaking, I think today we are trained from the business sector to control risk, to avoid risk, to keep, very tight control of what we are doing. That is what we report to our boards. And I think the change we are going into in order to really have a chance to contribute at the magnitude we need to contribute to this challenge require a very different kind of leadership in the companies. We need to take different risk. We need to create innovation at a much higher phase. We need to accept that we will do a lot of failures. And it's not today these things that we hear on conferences that, you know, we celebrate failures. We are not celebrating failures in the business sector. If you fail, you are out. So it's like some kind of acceptance that if you really should, you know, contribute on this, you need to, you know, have a different culture from the board, from your shareholders, down to the management. Also in the sense that you kind of involve the whole organization to bring up ideas. It's not only the good ideas coming from the top management, you know. You need to involve the whole organization. And again, you need to build a culture when ideas are flowing into the companies. And I think that is about some elements about the new leadership we need to have going forward. And in that sense, I think, you know, building platforms where companies can go together is a powerful means of driving this transformation. It's hard to do it alone. It is easier if you can do it with like-minded companies. So within industry sectors or cross sectors, to build kind of strong networks where those who really want to go in front of this and see the business opportunities of going in front can work together in order to kind of de-risk this and to build that kind of culture which we will need in order to address these challenges. I think at least that is one barrier which we need to address.
No, really super. So in the same spirit of connecting executive pay to KPIs around carbon reduction, also building a culture where failure is accepted so that you can experiment. And that reminds me of Alex's lovely Bauhaus idea. The point is that we need to experiment and try things and not to be so rigid about it. And then, of course, also connecting into what Jérôme has said about the platforms of the OGCI, the whole point of it is that you can go more effectively together than you can alone. So I think those are really more really good points about what can happen within business. So next, Leo Burke, Professor of Climate Investing Initiative at the University of Notre Dame. Leo, what have you got for us?
I can summarize, I'll do this quickly. I can summarize a barrier and a solution both in one word, and that is data. Data. Okay. We need reporting that is standardized, has enough specificity to enable us to achieve our objectives, and is transparent. And so this is absolutely critical that we see the right kind of reporting throughout industries and across industries. And we need to understand also that transparency implies, as Georg was saying yesterday, that data is public. If data is behind a paywall, it's not transparent. And so this is very, very critical that over the next 24 months, we have much more standardization that I presume TCFD will be adopted more and more with variations. And it's absolutely critical if we're going to control this issue.
Great, thank you. What do you think it will take? I mean, there's the TCFD, there's the work of organizations like the Carbon Disclosure Project. What do you think it's going to take within the next 24 months to get that standardizing specificity and transparency?
Well, I'll just lean this way to my two previous colleagues. It's going to take leadership and vision.
How do we make that happen?
Talking to people. And actually, investors have a big role to play in this. A very, very big role.
Yeah. And we're going to neatly come on to investors next then. So but we're going to come back to all of this, I'm sure. But next, this panel is a mix of corporate and investors as well. And we have now Rebecca Thomas, who works with Georg at Arabesque. And Rebecca, what do you think?
So this point was already brought up earlier in the discussion, but the lack of incentives, or the fact that the incentives are kind of in the wrong place, I think is one of the key barriers. So what's really pushing companies to increase transparency and make the required changes. So at the moment, the current system is set up to, the investors really have to, the investors need good news every quarter. So they want the money, but you need to be able to focus on the longer term and say that maybe in the short term, yes, you might have some money, but in the longer term, it's always going to be a loss. So changing that incentive to the longer term focus. And also there is some push from consumers, but at the moment, again, the incentive is not in the right place. It's currently more expensive to make the right choices. So trying to make it easier for people to make the right choices, and that should be the sort of the optimal choice, really.
So what do you think it will take? I mean, from this 6 weekly advice, quarterly reporting, short-term gain, long-term loss, what does it take to change that in the investors' world?
Yeah, I suppose more leadership as well. But there is a lot of push from investors. They are waking up to the problems. They know that they are starting to ask for more transparency on climate change, but really making it the norm and really pushing more companies to start reporting and kind of forcing them to report, essentially. So requiring the reporting rather than just allowing companies to get away without reporting.
Thank you. I think the word leadership is coming up again and again now, and it's going to come up more. And in a way, you know, I heartily support it. At the same time, it's a very big bucket. How do you make something happen? And I think I really liked Jérôme's point about, you know, you need the first mover, you need the second, you need the third, and then it starts to become normal. And we had that in the panel this morning as well from Alex and others, that if you can show something happening, then you can actually get more weight behind it. And first of all, it starts being the cool kids are over there, and then, oh my gosh, everyone's over there, and I'm going to miss out. So that again, we didn't do this deliberately for the order, but that brings us very neatly on to the next speaker, who is Herman Bril. So you have been doing this with your pension fund. So tell me, what do you think is stopping this happening, and how do we get around it?
Yeah, so I think, you know, actually Leo stole my point about data. But let me talk about measurement, because data is one thing, but measurement is really critical. And the reason why I'm saying that is because investors are capital allocators, and we need to have reliable, timely information to make decisions. And so measurement is really important of data, of course. And I think there is also a strong role for regulators to set standards for reporting, because we have a lot of different types of reporting going on. A lot of vendors are active in this space, but it's like a bit of a cottage industry with a lot of the different type of surveys. I'm sure that a lot of companies get, you know, a bunch of surveys to fill in, and then there's another one coming. So I think standard setting for reporting would be really helpful for investors. And I think, you know, there's the famous saying from Peter Drucker, who said, "What's get measured, get managed." Yeah. Right, and I think that's critical. So again, if you have these measures within your company and the reporting standards, and it sits under the same remit, you know, it sits under the CFO, which is actually, you know, and they know how to deal with reporting because they deal with accounting and everything. So you need sort of the rigorous sort of CFO framework and accountability to do the reporting, because then it becomes really very meaningful in an organization.
Sure.
So that is one thing. So I think second item is, I think education is important. To be honest, I mean, it sounds maybe a little bit rude, but if I see what currently students are learning going to a finance department, I'm sorry, that's really completely outdated. I mean, come on, they're still teaching the same stuff what I had to learn in the 80s, and it's so irrelevant, you can't believe it. So, and I want to be constructive, by the way, on this. This is not criticism, but it is. I think the message is important, because we need to learn the right stuff for today, and not the stuff that was relevant for 50 years ago, right? And I think that is a really important point. Thirdly, my item would be a narrative. Language, narrative, communication. I think words like social responsible investing is so outdated too, right? It's really like the 80s and the 90s. And it creates polarization, because if I'm saying I'm a responsible investor, so what are you, an irresponsible investor or something? You must be really weird, right? Yeah. So I think that is not helpful, right? And for me, the way I implement it in the organization is actually to frame it in the language of investors and say, guys, this is just common sense stuff. You should always look at this stuff because it will have impact on the share price. Nothing exotic about it, to be honest. But we didn't have the tools and the data to look at it. But don't use all these, words and language which is not helpful for investors, because they don't feel really connected. Most of them don't feel really like, so I think the narrative is really important. I like the SDGs, by the way, not because I think they're very practical, right? I have to say that because I've worked for the UN. But not because they're extremely practical from a technical perspective of trying to reach 169 different targets. Because is there any company or organization in the world who can manage 169 targets? I don't know anyone, right? It's far too complicated. But having said that, I think the narrative around the SDGs is extremely intuitive. It's extremely attractive because it makes a lot of sense. So I think for companies to figure out where can I play a material role around the SDGs, and material is everything here. Not like a little bit or I can't measure it, or it's about materiality. Everything is about materiality. And so if you figure out two things, do no harm, right? That's a very simple principle, but extremely powerful. And secondly is where can I make a really material impact? And still from a business perspective, because businesses, they have a purpose, but they also have a constraint, and the constraint is making money, because there is no business without any profit, right? And so I think linking the purpose to the SDGs, while acknowledging that we have to make money as well on the side, because otherwise we cannot pay our employees, we cannot afford the research, we cannot pay our shareholders, so we have to make money. That's a simple, rule number one of capitalism, I think. But it's not the sole sort of purpose to make as much money as possible. I think you really should link it to the purpose and actually to an attractive narrative, and you can actually use the SDGs for that, or other ways. But I think, for me, I think that's what I like about the SDGs. So narrative, language, communication, I think is really important too.
Thanks very much, Herman. The measurement point, I hope we can go into a little bit more what the implications are of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and what we can maybe do to help accelerate the uptake and the standardization. I think that's going to be important. Education, we will come back to in the final panel. We're hearing it again and again. I don't want to diminish it, but we're certainly going to talk about it more. Can I just give extra oomph to that point about narrative? I think it should be front and center of everything we're doing. And I'm glad you mentioned that about the SDGs. We're wearing our little badges and very fair comment. They're complicated. If you look at them from a logical point of view, is this really practical? But the story, the difference, if you remember the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were essentially, let's try and be nice to poor people in our spare time, right? I paraphrase, but that's what they were. And the Sustainable Development Goals, involving business in the development of them from the beginning, is stopping being, let's do something on the side if we want to be nice, and starting saying this should be at the heart of what we do. And that was such a big narrative shift. I've heard again and again, I did not hear all the businesses I work with putting up slides about the Millennium Development Goals, unless they were particularly advanced. But again and again now, the SDGs are right up there. So I think that the point about what's a narrative, and just wanted to come back to something Jérôme said. He said carbon tax, carbon incentive. And if you call it a carbon tax, there's nowhere in the world you're going to get it. If you call it a carbon incentive, you've got a completely different story. And it's the same thing. And it's the same thing. So I think a lot of these areas, we do have broken narratives, or old narratives, old-fashioned ones. And if we can refresh those, we can move very, very quickly. It's the thing that's probably closest to my heart. Did you want to say something, Jérôme, before we go on?
One point which is very important to what you just said, which is when I look at what we do as corporates, generally we were building strategies and developing a narrative behind to justify our strategy. In fact, when I look at the speed at which the world is changing and needs to change, we need to reverse completely the way we do it, which is we need to build first the narrative and then develop the strategy based on our narrative. And it may sound just pure semantic to you. It's a complete change of the way we develop our business models as corporates. I think that's very important.
Again, hugely important. We're certainly going to come back to that. I put 2 stars next to it. Not starting with a strategy and then figuring out how to communicate it, but starting with a narrative and then working out what the strategy needs to be around that. I think that's going to be huge. Bjørn?
Building on the same, and I think very important, I think from the business sector, is to start talking about tax and taxation. The business sector cannot develop in a society that fails. And I think coming back to the narrative, talking about tax as an investment into the society, give a different kind of contribution to that debate. So I think, again, it is a big barrier today that some sectors in the business are not kind of contributing equally.
Yeah.
So I think the issue about tax is important. And we are going into a huge transformation, and we need to take that debate, but maybe we should learn from this debate to change the narrative of it, because it is an investment into that society that we shall, earn our money going forward.
I love that, actually. I just had to pay my taxes on the 31st of January, and I called my bank to pay them, and I said, I want to pay my taxes, and they said, oh, I'm sorry. And I said, actually, I wish I'd said, no, actually, this is my investment into society. I would have felt an awful lot better about it. Heidi Huusko, so Senior Manager of Environment and Climate at the UN Global Compact. You were calling yesterday really for greater ambition in the corporate world. What do you think is the barrier stopping that, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I'm really happy that we already started to talk about the narrative, and I think we were in a good place in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, where we really could simplify what needed to be done. And we saw that climate change is a challenge. We saw that we need to rally around together in these collective actions around carbon pricing, science-based targets, renewable energy, etc. Today we know that it's more complex than this because we are in an implementation phase. Back then, we wanted to support a greater goal. We had a common vision of where we wanted to go. Now we're doing the hard stuff because now we need to take this down to how we actually implement that goal in our companies. And also this then becomes so different because in various regions it varies on what is, most, you talked about materiality. Same goes for various reasons. It's always context specific. It's very sectorial, and climate as a whole is a very complex topic. So it's no longer a siloed issue as climate, but it actually aligns to so many other social topics, to biodiversity and nature, and all of that is lacking from the climate change narrative. And I think this is where, from the UN Global Compact side, we really see an opportunity to go back to the vision and the mandate of the UN Global Compact to work on a principle-based approach. The UN Global Compact asks its companies to align with human rights, with anti-corruption, societal topics, and environmental topics. And doing that, you really, if companies would be doing that, we wouldn't be here today talking about the problem. So it really goes back into the basics. And I also wanted to, reflect on the SDG question and criticism as well, because remember that the Sustainable Development Goals were, they were agreed on between member states. These are goals for nations, and the targets therefore are based for member states, not for companies. So the 169 targets are not meant to be for for corporations. And the UN Global Compact, together with GRI, has done some great materials to help companies guide themselves into, what sustainable development goal is most material for the company, and again, bringing those elements back into a principle-based approach. So starting from the basic principles on supporting UN norms and UN issues, you can then use the SDGs as kind of a way to materialize your efforts or put your actions together through kind of these goals, depending on what is material. So my point is that it's we're in a time now where we're implementing. It's becoming more complex, and we need to recognize that in some way. And it's interesting to listen to the carbon pricing points as well. And I'm just reflecting on in 2014 when Georg and a group of us sat down to talk about carbon pricing and what needed to be done on leadership criteria on carbon pricing. And we looked at the internal price that companies were using for their carbon, and we wanted that to be materially high enough for companies to go back and invest in renewables in their companies. We also wanted to make sure that the companies would align their carbon pricing with policy engagement. We know that companies are engaging in not so constructive policy engagement, across the sectors, and very often are not aligning actually with their own climate actions. Their other public apartments are doing the opposite. So we wanted those two to go together and then, of course, report through CDP so that there was transparency. What I want to come to is that I think that there's a next elevation of this now, because we know that we need to put in the social elements into this. We know that we need to look at climate through also other environmental topics. Maybe there's time to have more of a principle-based carbon pricing discussion happening.
Okay, thank you. I think it's interesting to me that each time we talk about this, it's like there's two levels in this complex implementation phase. First of all, there's the how to make it specific, like which of the SDGs are relevant to you, how can you actually do something about it, which sort of resonates to me with the point that we had in the previous panel about acting locally or being very, very specific and targeted. But you're also talking about a principles, vision, reminding us why we're doing this approach. And normally it's either or. But actually, I think I'm hearing again and again that it has to be both for this to work. There has to be the practical on the ground in the context of something that's a widely agreed vision, yeah? Okay. Then I think that this is all coming together very nicely. Thanks. You're making my job later much easier. So we have two more speakers. So Yin Bo, who's the Deputy Director of the Europe Office of the Global Energy Interconnection Development and Cooperation Organization. Did I get that right? Yeah. So tell me, what do you think are the barriers and what could we do about them?
Well, as I mentioned yesterday during my presentation, I said that our organization is aiming to improve the electrification, to facilitate the development of renewable energy, and then finally we want to establish a globally interconnected power grid. It is very easy to figure out that we need tremendous investment. I can share some numbers with you guys. For the construction of GEI, actually the total investment would be $38 trillion US. It's quite a large number. And among them, $27 trillion US is for their renewable generation. And the other 11 trillion is for the grid construction. And among them, 390 billion US are for the intercontinental construction. I know all of you are shocked. That's why one of our vice president is actually Mr. Masayoshi-san. He is the CEO of SoftBank. We do think investment is quite important to us. But today, what I want to say is actually the biggest barrier for us to build GEI is not the numbers, but actually the minds. I think we have to extend our mind to a global level. That's what I want to say. Actually, I also said this yesterday. If we want to achieve GEI, actually most of the projects will concentrate in the developing countries, like in Africa, in Latin America. But someone would say that, is that we can only use the contributed system for the renewables in Africa. But actually, I have to say, I've learned from the report published by World Bank that actually most of the population in Africa, they are using the wood for cooking. When we were talking about the replacement of the fossil energy, it is another story in Africa. The emission for the cooking is really, really large. It's very astonished. I was astonished by that number. So in this kind of situation, can you imagine how the African population afford for the contributed system, afford for the electricity? Actually, it's not possible currently. So we have to extend our mind. We have to find another way. Like there is a very famous project, I'm sure that most of you would know that is Great Inga. I also mentioned this yesterday. The Great Inga, we all know that actually there is a very great potential to develop it. If we can develop it, the electricity would be very cheap. But can it be consumed locally? Obviously cannot. So the only way for us to develop that is that we have to export the electricity to some other countries like South Africa, even Egypt, even more far away like Europe. So that's our mind. We can extend our mind. We cannot just solve the problem in Africa, but maybe larger scale. That is the first thing. The second thing is actually, we all know that the governments in African countries are not so stable. They're changing very frequently. They're not so reliable, including some governments in Southeast Asia. I have to say that actually one of our members, they started a project in Myanmar. They signed a contract, but after the government was taken over by another party, they just denied that contract that they have signed. So if we just solve their problem within Africa, I think this will be not so easy for us to overcome. So that's what I want to say.
Sure.
We have to extend our mind to a global level. We have more cooperation is needed. And talking about cooperation, actually we think GEIDCO, our organization, is a kind of platform for collaboration, for cooperation. I think the investors in Western countries, in America and in China, we can sit together. We can talk about this. Actually, we think we all have some advantages because actually we know China has a lot of capitals. And actually some Western investors, they have the best technologies. Then we can sit together. I know it's kind of ideology, but actually I think this is what really cooperation means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is interesting because we heard this morning about earlier about the importance of investing in international cooperation, and just now for corporates it's easier to do it together with like-minded companies, although collaborations are very complicated beasts. You only do them if you really can't do it any other way because they're very hard to manage. But I do think it's interesting. I've certainly heard this point made many times that if a problem seems intractable, make it bigger. And it seems paradoxical. You think we're trained to think that you need to narrow it down and slice it down, but often if you just make the problem bigger, you find a solution that you didn't see before, and it sounds like that.
That's right.
And then the other point is the mindset. We need to change our mindsets, which is what the narrative conversation was really all about. So I can see some very good, important common themes that are coming through this.
And actually there is another thing I have to highlight, that maybe someone would challenge that it's not safe if all the grid is interconnected. The energy security is a big problem if we achieve GEI. But I have to say that actually we can find solutions. Just imagine the internet, as I mentioned yesterday. Once upon a time, we were always arguing that the internet is not safe. Even including the internet banks, the mobile banks, we think it's not safe. Maybe someone can steal my information from the internet. Yes, it did happen, but we can find solutions. The internet is not out of control, right? And actually, last month, when I was sitting in Beijing at home, my credit card was used in America. Someone would say that, whoa, the credit card is safer than the mobile bank. But actually, when I use Alipay in China, this kind of situation never happened. So that's what I want to say. Just open your mind. We can find solutions. Don't worry about this big dream.
You heard it here. Let's give that a round of applause, eh? Okay, and finally, before we go to more of the conversation, our last speaker is Colin Price, who's Head of Environmental Studies at Tel Aviv University. What have you got for us, Colin?
So I'm the odd fish here, I think, because I don't come from finance, I don't come from corporations, I come from academia, I'm a university professor. But I want to speak about maybe a possible solution, part of the solution, an example that we've developed at our university and with a combination of government, corporations, industry, and academia, where actually I'm the head of a center for innovation in transportation. Mm-hmm. And we actually get funding. We got funding from the government, from the Prime Minister's office for 5 years to actually manage this fund to bring startup companies to the university, to the campus, in the topic of innovation in transportation, smart mobility. And we take 5 to 6 startup companies at the very early stages, so there's just a few guys with an idea. They get some funding, they get a place to sit in our green building on campus, they get advice, mentorship for 6 months, and then they're out in the market alone. And 20% of them have been successful in raising venture capital and continuing. 80% have failed, but in the startup companies and startup world, you have to fail in order to succeed. So that's a good thing, actually. Failing it means that you'll eventually succeed. So this is a model that we're now trying to expand, actually, because of this investment in the bottom-up approach from the startups. We have hundreds of companies now in Israel on smart mobility, transportation, whether it's cybersecurity or new batteries, even management doesn't have to be high-tech, applications for and hardware, software on garbage trucks, for example, to improve the ability and the efficiency of garbage trucks in the city. And we're now trying to move into other areas related to air pollution, climate change. I should point out that I haven't heard much about air pollution, actually, in the last 2 days. And I think this is one way, action item, where we can actually get people on board for climate change. Because if you talk to people about air pollution and saving lives, the estimate's about 7 million people die every year from air pollution, whether it's indoor air pollution from the fires and stoves in India, Africa, or outdoor air pollution. If we clean up air pollution, we also are going to reduce CO2, and we're going to help the climate as well. So we all know that talking about the climate and change of 1 degree doesn't really move people, but if you can talk about air pollution and reduce the number of people that are going to die from air pollution, at the same time, you're also going to impact climate change. So that's another area I think we should go into. We should actually emphasize when we try to talk about climate change, the health benefits of dealing with the climate. So I think the bottom-up approach is maybe better than the top-down from the corporations, maybe both of them. But I think my optimism is actually in the younger generation. We have the students here, spoke earlier. As being a university, we're also introducing, to talk about the education aspect, a new degree, actually, which is going to be based around project-based learning. So they're not going to be lectures anymore. We're going to change that the students will work in groups of 3 or 4, 5 students to solve problems, environmental problems, where they'll work on a project for 6 weeks at a time with industry, with corporations, but bringing students from different backgrounds, as you said, from music, from law, from engineering, from life sciences. And when you bring these young people together, nothing's impossible. We have another example. I also work in the space environment with small satellites now, what they call CubeSats. And we have high school kids now who are building them. And when we went to the high school kids and we said to them, in 2 years' time, we want to have a satellite in orbit. They said, sure, no problem. Just start working. You go to one of us or one of your friends and you ask them, put a satellite in space in 2 years, they say it's impossible. So I think the future, the optimist, is actually the younger generation, both in education and in the universities. We need to change the way we educate them, but to give them the opportunity to find solutions. Yeah. And there's where I see the catch, where the barrier is, and that's again related to the first talk, the financing. When the finances run out, they stop developing new ideas. So we need to take the money from the people who have it and invest in these young minds in the universities and startup companies in different fields, and I'm sure they'll find the solutions for us. Thank you.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We've heard this education point again and again, but what I like especially about that, you know, put a satellite up in the air in 2 years, we need to instill a sense of urgency. And where can that sense of urgency come from when corporates have built up over so many years, when the finance sector has built up over so many years, when the importance is to be careful, to think about risk, to plan for 30 or 40-year projects? How can we get that entrepreneurial, dynamic, urgent mindset into the places that have the money and the resources? Jérôme and then Bjørn.
Okay. Yeah, so just building on what you said, I think also, you know, many of our, call it the traditional industries will change. I mean, internet is basically turning the business models around. So I think also, building on what you said going forward, the importance of building collaboration, not only within the industries or the existing industries, but, you know, inviting other industries in to collaborate, because I think a lot of the innovation and the solutions is not only within the existing industries, but it is between, you know, how we organize the industries today. So to encourage this kind of cross-industry collaboration is important. And just to say, I also support a lot what you say about this bottom-up, where you also kind of invite different disciplines into the problem-solving process. I think that is also so crucial. Again, coming back to the magnitude of the challenge, we need to do things differently going forward. If we continue to do it as we have done, we are not going to solve these problems fast enough.
Sure. Jérôme.
I would like to propose to establish a link between urgency on one side and access to energy, cook stoves, deforestation, nature-based solution, carbon pricing, $450 per ton in the O&M world, as we have heard this morning, as marginal cost of abating CO2. And the link is the following. To succeed on climate, we need to make it a race, but a business race, where individuals, companies in particular, and states are incentivized to race, and I would almost say to race one against the other competitively, to abate CO2 emission as fast as possible. And here is the point. In Europe, for instance, I take Europe as an example, not as a target, but as an example. As we have heard this morning, we have to abate CO2 through the ETS, which is good because it is there, it exists. And the marginal cost of abating CO2 is between $100 per ton and $450 per ton, as we have heard this morning. And it takes between 2 years and 5 years to abate that ton of CO2. The cycle to get it done is between 2 years and 5 years. That's not very compelling. If Volkswagen, for instance, was forced, sorry, but I am picking a Volkswagen, I could take any company, anywhere, not to abate its CO2 tons in Europe necessarily, but anywhere when it can, where it can, anywhere, at the lowest cost. Volkswagen would race to Africa to abate tons of CO2 in 1 month at $10 per ton, marginal cost, and would thereby finance the green fund, the $100 billion green fund that is not financed otherwise, and would avoid deforestation, would avoid local pollution, would fight climate faster, and would make EVs available, carbon neutral EVs available to customers in Europe at a lower cost.
What would it take to make that happen?
Oh, very simply. we have to revive, to put back on the table what we killed because it was not efficient at the beginning, which was invented by Kyoto, which were the CDMs.
Yeah.
We have to come back to Article 6 of COP21 agreement. Article 6 open for that. And we have to make Article 6 a reality, allowing for emitters in the north to finance CO2 emissions avoidance in the south or anywhere at the cheapest, the fastest. And doing it this way, we will organize a race between Volkswagen, BP, Equinor, Total, Renault, Peugeot, Arcelor, and all others, because they will all race to get to find these spots of emissions avoidance wherever they are. The fastest, the better, the cheapest. And that, obviously, it has to be organized because it has to be made in a way that could not be seen as greenwashing, that would be additive, that would be professional, that would strike all the SDG metrics that are necessary with a net positive impact. So it's not that simple to do, but it is the price to pay to win the race and to finance the $100 billion green fund.
Sure.
Because there is no other source of funding.
Sure, and bringing competition into the play is actually a very powerful way to get urgency. What do they say? They say if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We want to go far, fast. So we need both collaboration and competition. Heidi.
Yeah, and for that we need timeline and milestones, and building on what Jérôme said, I think also in the lead up, I've spoken about the Paris Agreement a couple of times, but I think it really gives a good example of kind of a race to the top, where we saw that companies really were stepping up with new commitment areas that would have not have happened otherwise. We have a similar milestone coming up this September. The Secretary General of the UN is calling on heads of state, of CEOs, of UN leaders and civil society to come to New York and discuss climate and the urgency around climate action. And why is this important? Because governments and leaders rarely know what companies are actually doing. There is a big gap here with what our leaders know, that what the commitments are from the company side, and this is a great opportunity to showcase that leadership and also rally up to that leadership.
Sure. So in a way, one of the challenges is that if we keep on having more conversations about what we need to do, then it gives a sense that we're solving the problem by having conferences. And that's always a bit of a challenge. But I think what's interesting here is what you're saying is, first of all, it's about the narrative. It's about connecting, getting the information from companies to policymakers that this is real, that this is happening, that we really want it. And the other thing is that it's an opportunity to have what Jérôme was just talking about, a bit of competition. Well, if you're going to do that, I'm going to do more. I'm going to build my building 10 feet higher, or 2 meters higher, or whatever. So, I just want to challenge slightly still the idea that what we need to do is have another conference. But at the same time, if it can spark that competition, that urgency, and at the same time can also help communicate better between businesses and policymakers, then that sounds like it has real value. So I'm going to, do we have any questions, comments straight away here? And then.
Well, I feel obliged to respond to the comment by Herman on the finance education. I mean, I in part agree that it needs to do a lot more in what's being taught in finance. Yeah. But I think also now it says citizens here, but it's a finance discussion. And I think, well, first of all, we have a capitalist system that responds to price signals. And for a lot of the reasons we talk about here about sustainability and climate change, maybe it's not relevant, but there's the financial sector still is, I mean, the capital asset price model is being used.
Sorry, say again?
I mean, all these models that we teach, they are being used for asset valuation and company valuation. And I think we have to find a way to fit in what we want to do in those models, not to kind of reinvent the capitalist system to kind of value assets in a new way. And so it is not obsolete in that sense. It might be obsolete for the challenge, but the demand from industry is still these models. That's what's being used.
Yeah,
unfortunately, but that's the case.
Herman, please.
I agree, and so we're stuck a little bit, right? And
I think we agree.
yeah, no, we had a conversation on this topic already, and so, but this is part of the problem, and the funny thing is, well, it's actually not funny, but I looked up how many business schools in the world is teaching sustainable finance, and there's sort of one, right, which is the University of Maastricht, I think. And so even in the US, you know, with top schools or the UK, they teach sustainability, but that's something else, right? And sustainable finance, you know, the way finance should play a much more important role in the discussion we have today, that's something the students need to learn, but also the people already in the business. And so basically, the portfolio managers of today, they also are still using all the same models and things which are not really a representation of reality. And so I agree with your point. So it's within the industry, we need to take action, and we need to teach the young kids.
We can fix it together.
What does it take to make that happen?
Well, go to a conference and start
You're not allowed to say
it.
conference, no. No, but absolutely seriously, what does it take to make that happen?
I can give examples. I mean, I went to university, to business school in New York, and for a conversation on this topic, and I said, listen, New York is the finance capital of the world. You are leading a business school here in New York, and if Larry Fink is sending letters to the CEOs about purpose and stuff, why don't you teach anything about this?
Yeah.
So I'm pushing them a bit, and they, they are very responsive, and so they want to do some stuff. But it's every organization of most organizations, they are not in terms of innovation and doing the next thing, especially also in universities. It's not always very easy to implement, and I think there's a lot of vested interest. Because of these things, so I also invited some other companies to broaden up the discussion, and actually say, do you need people with a different type of training? So having a broader dialogue with business schools and the industry, and hopefully will help them to get to the next level.
So one point is the business schools, and is there an opportunity then to broker some kind of a collective approach from a whole set of different asset owners, asset managers, collectively to target individual business schools and say, here's what we want you to do? That's something practical that can happen. And then the other question is, there is all this movement in the finance sector, and there's also, forgive me, this is not my area, but it is my interest and passion. There's been, from where I sit, it looks like there's been a vast amount of experimentation and change in the finance sector over the last 20 years or more, with different instruments and different approaches and different technologies. So it doesn't look to me like an industry that struggles to change. It looks to me that like an industry where there isn't the right incentive to make this kind of change.
I think it's a combination. I think that the finance sector depends which part of the sector you look at, but it is a traditional sector. Yes, we developed all kinds of instruments and technology and tools and what have you, but the way people think about finance and the purpose of finance, that is very sort of traditional. And I mean, clearly, if you go to the hedge funds and where the really smart people doing very interesting stuff, but in general, if you look at the finance industry and have a discussion about what is the purpose of finance, you will be surprised.
So that's a narrative point again. Yeah. It's a really strong narrative point. It's not that it's not an industry that's capable of the rapid change, but it is the mindset, which is what we've been talking about quite a bit. Heidi and then Jérôme.
Just this reminds me of an experience when I was a student and studying ecological economics and business administration. I was the president of an organization, a student organization in Sweden, running for sustainable development in all educations in Sweden. And it just reminds me of the youth movement that is happening. Back then we advocated the ministers, and ultimately the Prime Minister of Sweden back then made a law and a policy of the fact that all universities in Sweden needed to have sustainable development in their programs at the universities as a cross-cutting topic. And I think that is something that really can also come from the student movements themselves, to be asking for sustainable finance education, and that's hopefully something that we'll see.
Great. And then also that was a point where policymakers can have an influence on the education, which helps them with the business. Jérôme, and then we'll come to there's a whole host of hands.
Two short points. The first one is, even if it is, I feel it is better and better, we have a problem on this, which is, to teach this, you need to have teachers. And here, we don't have teachers, because teachers are generally of our generation, and we are not good, and we have not been good on that. So what we need here is reverse mentoring, and we need to invent reverse mentoring on these topics. So that's the first comment. And the second one is that it's good to talk about business schools, but I believe what policymakers can do even more easily is make sure that as soon as primary school, responsible consumption is taught as much as mathematics.
Well, okay.
As soon as primary school.
At primary school.
From primary school. That is, it should be a circular economy. It should be part of what is taught to our kids as soon as primary schools.
Brilliant. Well, and we're going to come back to that more in the citizens. So we've got a whole host of hands, starting here, and behind you, then Bjørn, Notre, and then here, and then over there.
Thank you, Herman, for bringing this topic of lack of special programs dedicated for sustainable finance. Actually, I think you are underestimating your skills as potential trainers for such programs. Because when I was doing an introductory course on Paris Climate Agreement and its consequences for Russian economy for our international master program, people were asking me, okay, you're telling us about energy efficiency in Russia, where can we go and see the results? So I arranged them a meeting with some CEOs of some large companies implementing projects. And it was really important for those young guys to see that something is already happening. And by saying this, just to confirm that European University is launching this year Introduction to Sustainable Energy course. And we are thinking now about Introduction to Sustainable Finance. And I will be delighted to invite some of you as a guest speakers or maybe keynote speakers to open this program.
Good. Who's game?
Thank you.
I want to see a forest of hands for who's game. Bjørn, Notre behind you, and then, hang on. So behind, sorry. Oh, we'll go this way. Go, it's all right, fine.
So just a quick comment. Just like the United Nations has Global Compact and PRI for investing, Georg Kell started the Principles of Responsible Management Education. The university that I work for is what they call a prime champion. And I think we all fall into the trap, even though I still feel like a business person, even though I'm in education, of saying, wow, this is difficult. At our university, was a 144-year-old university. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is the center of our research agenda. That happened in less than 1 year. Profitability and sustainability and the aversion of material business risks is the lens that we use to teach everything across the university.
Great.
And that all happened in 3 or 4 years' time.
And that's the kind of urgency we need, preferably even more. Bjørn, Notre?
I just wanted to provide some hope, because at the Imperial College, there's this Grantham Institute. And I'm part of the advisory council, there is a master's program on climate change and finance alone. So if you're interested in spreading that idea, look at that. And also last year, I think the nearly top US 20 business schools, Harvard, Stanford, Yale,
Yeah.
what have you, organize a dedicated program across all these fine business schools on climate in particular,
Yeah.
to elevate it. So I think there is an interest going on. I have one question on finance. I really don't know who to direct it to. But I think it's amazing, and I think it's a very profound thing that investors are asking companies to provide data and provide performance. But is there something missing in that equation? Because you're putting demands on businesses. But what is actually that the financial sector will start doing differently? What's their kind of contribution on the journey? Apart from asking others to reveal data and hopefully perform better. But what's the other part of the contract, so to speak? Could you just spell it out to me? So it'll be easy for me to...
I think, yeah, very good challenge, very good question. I think Rebecca and Herman, that's probably for you. And then we had a whole slew of hands over here. So tell me again who wants to speak over there. Okay.
I can explain why, because you need then one way of potentially responding to that or contributing would be say, okay, if you're doing good, we're gonna be more of a long-term investor. We're gonna stay with you for 3 years, for instance. Or we're gonna get rid of day trading in your asset, or we're not gonna jump on quarterly financial numbers. We're gonna behave differently. Yeah. So I'm just curious, what's the thinking and reasoning around this?
So let's
because apart from expressing good intentions.
Let's go specifically, so any thoughts on that, apart from and this is, I think, probably for you too, since you're financial representatives on the panel.
Can I just very briefly, I mean, one key assumption, of course, is that a better integration of risks improves the allocation process. And that is happening already, arguably, on a very big scale already. It's soft transition, which many investors are already starting to do. They use data to better inform their analysis, which in turn leads to smarter allocation. It happens big scale already on a portfolio context. Currently, $26 trillion asset under management already go through some soft version of that. And the data side is still imperfect at some level, but it's getting better every day almost. So you can see a massive relocation of capital away from low to better performers. And that improves, obviously, the time horizons where capital stays with you. It will also improve your valuation, reduce your costs of capital. So it's a systemic approach to relocation across the board. That is one way. The other way, and Herman, you're much better positioned to answer that, is the engagement component, which increasingly is building up as well. Yeah. So it's these two dimensions, valuation, cost of capital, systemic relocation away from towards, which arguably is already ongoing. Some experts call it the soft transition, because some argue for divestment, and Herman made the point very eloquently on that yesterday. I totally agree. But that is really how finance is waking up, and it's driven by risk and opportunity consideration equally.
Got it.
Climate risks increasingly are finding their way into the analysis. Yes, the tools are still in the making, but they're getting better, and the anticipation is very clear. And that is a very narrow incentive. There's still the tragedy of the horizon, as Mark Carney called it, because most traditional investors still project the future discounts of the net present value based on past experiences, and maybe they look 1 year ahead or maximum 3 years ahead, whereas most of those risks are building up slowly, and it's the white elephant is dark in the night. Yeah. But that is rapidly changing now, and arguably as events create, and the physical impact is increasing, record level of $168 billion last year. The awareness is rapidly shooting up.
Yeah, and we'll come to Herman for that. Just very quickly for my two penners, I'll name check, for example, Hermes, which has now put a tool onto the desktop of every fund manager to incorporate the profits at risk from changing policy around climate into their decisions, the increasing ESG integration, all of that stuff. So, you know, it is clearly already happening. The question is, what more can happen? So, Herman.
Yeah, I completely agree with what has been said already. But I think the point is more in terms of the finance sector is not one actor. That has many components. You have institutional investors like pension funds, and I think the comments Georg was making was sort of reflecting that part of the sector. But you also have the high-frequency traders, you have the hedge funds, you have day traders, you have you and I buying and selling stocks for our private savings, and so it's a sector with a lot of different actors in it, and they they actually have different strategies. They apply to you know, make money, I guess. And yeah, so there is a huge volatility around earnings, and if you miss your earnings, then you're going to drop, you know, like, you know, and so, and there is always in stock markets more volatility, especially at stock level, than the underlying business would actually justify. So there's too much movement related to the underlying business. I think that's, I mean, I don't know, I don't have a solution for that per se, but I think dealing with sort of institutional money, which has a much more longer term of holding period. So we're not day traders. We're not just going in and out, and we have a longer horizon. And we are working also to improve our engagement to make sure we have a constructive dialogue with companies like yourself and others. And so I think that, so to your point, what do we need to do? Why do we need to have the data? I mean, if you are in the business of allocating capital, it is about the risk-return decision you make. And the risk is not only a financial risk for looking at accounting, it's sort of more a holistic type of risk we're facing as investors and you're facing as a business. And so we want to understand your holistic risk profile at a societal perspective, because all those elements can impact your business. And so that's how we try to make decisions. But I understand that the financial markets show a lot of volatility, which is not always helpful, I think.
Okay, thanks, Andrea.
I just would like to give a comment to the speech of Imbo. I've been very much impressed by your comments, and I think we all should take note of your invitation to open our mind, to extend our mind. And basically you said extend our mind because we have to go global. I think we could add other things on this. I think that what we are doing is very much connected on something that has been stated also last year, that is underlining what we are saying, discussing today, which is that decarbonization will be the big things of 21st century, that infrastructure will double in the next 15 years, which means business is there, demand will be there. And in a very optimistic way, a very positive and optimistic way, you just say, let's go there. There are problems, we will solve the problem. And sorry to say that, but unfortunately, on the other side, we have a lot of barriers. You know, we are missing transparency. We are missing a standard on the report. And so I think we should consider and take into consideration your great message that you are bringing here, and which is also connected to what Giovanna Melandri was saying, that the private sector may play really a definitive role. Because when you make too many discussions, you say this and that, then you have a private player like you saying, okay, we go global, we are positive, we need how many trillion, 38, 40, go. And we don't care so much. And you don't care so much of the assessment of the risk. Probably you don't have so many spread out shareholders. Okay, you have different, okay. But I think we have to consider and to think about your message or your lesson. And I would like to say that I think it's Napoleon. He used to say, First, we do think. Paper is coming after. Okay, no, not before paper and then action. Yeah. You don't get vision by paper. Paper are not giving you vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Go on, yes. Go
Yeah,
on.
I just want to say a few words about that. Actually, I totally agree your point, actually. I think in a short term, of course, all the projects has to be commercially successful. Then there is no investors would do that if it is just an idea, just a concept, which is not so beneficial. So what I mean is actually we can start from some specific project which is matured, like from China to Myanmar to Bangladesh, from China to Korea to Japan to Russia. We do have some specific places which we have finished the feasibility studies and which we find a very good way to invest. That is what I mean. We are not. What I mean is not. Okay, we can invest anywhere. We can do everything anywhere. That's not what I mean. We also have to do that step by step, by choose some good chances. Thank you.
So we have two questions here, comments in the audience, and then I want to come back to the panel. So Henrik was next, and then Giovanna, and then we have someone back there. You could make them, we're running out of time, but this is a really good conversation, so you make them kind of tight.
Yeah. I'll be quick. I would like to hear some comments from the panel on the role of the rating companies. At least until the last crisis, there was a lot of credibility with the rating bureaus. But as Geo say, you rate some financial risk, which may give you some idea whether they'll go bankrupt in 12 months. So when are we going to have a sort of very credible sustainability rating, where you rate the social governance, ethics, climate issues?
The rating agencies announced very recently that they incorporate these factors in their rating methodology. And I think Fitch just published a methodology document. And so they don't call it a sustainability rating because their job is not to measure sustainability as a theme. Their job is to measure creditworthiness of the organization. And so physical risk, transition risk, those type of things, they are incorporated now in their credit ratings. And I think that's I applaud that. I think it's a great step forward. But I think a sustainability rating would be more linked to an SDG footprint of a company, right? So there's a different type of rating than looking just at the credit risk. And so credit ratings look at credit risk, but credit risk is being influenced by underlying physical risk, transition risk, all kinds of risks, which are relevant for the credit profile of the company. Sustainability rating is something else, and that could be something for organizations to step into and to look at an SDG footprint of a company and apply a rating to it. But yeah.
So we've had this comment. Leo, if I can ask you, you brought up data from the beginning, both as a barrier and a solution. And we've had this sort of coming back again and again, that with transparency in data, with actually a way to choose, decide, represent the relationship between investors and business, that's the way to get a better answer. We've talked about the TCFD. So there's lots of sustainability rating or the risk rating, risk profile, the TCFD recommendations. How can we see a path through this, and how can we influence the uptake of it so we can get a better answer?
I think various investment groups, like Climate Action 100+, as an example, and umbrellas of investors are pushing for standardization. So it's very, very important. Everybody's reporting some data, but looking across companies, it can be apples, oranges, and bananas, So the standardization factor is extremely important. And then there's a movement that not everyone agrees with in the investment community, but of how would you link what a company is doing to specific targets related to Paris. There's some controversy about that, but we need a level of specificity. And again, I think it's the investors, and particularly, at least what I'm seeing, asset owners that are driving this more than financial managers. And I think we'll see a continued trend, excuse me, continued trend in this direction.
What can we do to help accelerate that in a good way? We or the people that we know?
Well, if you have a pension, you can be in touch with your pension firm and let them know about your concerns. If you have money in a large asset management firm, you can call your interface and express concerns. These are very, very important. You know, it doesn't take that many people. If somebody hears, if Larry Fink hears from 30 people, you know, all of a sudden it's the buzz, you know, in BlackRock. So it doesn't take that much to get people thinking differently.
I absolutely love that, and I'd like to come back to it again. Let me just say it again out loud. If Larry Fink hears this from 30 people, then it's the buzz in BlackRock. So a lot of this is really hard, this is really difficult, but it comes back to the point about the narrative, really. This is the thing that people are talking about, we need to do something, right? Jérôme, and then we have a gentleman back there.
Yes.
Have you got it already?
Yeah. Maybe just one additional point on what you just said. I think working through pensions and investors is critical, but we have to keep in mind that in the world of energy, and here I am going to focus on oil and gas, 80%, more than 80% of the production is in the hands of national oil companies, the investors of which are states. We are talking about Saudi Arabia, we are talking about Iraq, Iran, Algeria, Russia, China, Mexico, Brazil, and so on and so forth. So it's critical to incentivize, push, and create regulations for the 15%. But we have to keep in mind that the 80 to 85 other percents are there and are not under the scrutiny of these pension funds and investors. Yeah. And then I would like to come back, if I may, to OGCI and what I'm representing or trying to represent here today, which is we are 13 companies, and out of these 13 companies, we have IOCs and NOCs. As part of OGCI, you have companies that are in the room, but you have as well Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco is more than 10 million barrels of oil per day. It's the largest company and the largest oil and gas producer in the world. You have PetroChina, you have Pemex, the Mexicans, and you have Petrobras, the Brazilians, i.e. the majority of OGCI in production is national oil companies. And then I would like to tell you a very short story about ourselves. When we were created in 2014, thanks to Georg, and I will come back on that at the very end if you allow me, Georg. Companies around the table only wanted to share good practices. They didn't want to engage, they didn't want to invest together, they didn't want to report, they didn't want to target together. But they allowed each other to do whatever they wanted together. Slowly but surely, 3 companies, then 5, then 6, then 7 started to report together with the same consistent metrics, to engage together, to think about targets together, and to think about investments together. In 2018, last year, for the first time, the 13 companies were reporting together, are reporting together, with a consistent methodology, are targeting together based on that reporting to reduce emissions consistently with the Paris Agreement in a short time frame, not a loosey long-term one, 2025, on methane first, and are spending and investing together. And thanks to just, I would say, incentivizing leadership across companies, Aramco, PetroChina, Pemex, Petrobras are now reporting their GHG emissions with the same methodology as BP, Equinor, Shell, Total, Eni, and the others. And that methodology will be from 2019 onwards audited to make sure it works. And they have committed collectively, all together, to a public target to reduce emissions. So the point I want to make is that there are other ways to get it done, which is through collective approaches, through incentivizing leadership among companies, and incentivizing almost a race of leadership among companies. And because nothing forces them to do it, nothing, except the will to lead together.
This is a lovely point, and I think it connects directly to what I think, was it Alex was talking about crystallization, like in chemistry, where you can get that crystallization. I'm afraid we've got one gentleman who's been very patient here, then we need to go back to the panel, we're running out of time, but there will be more chances to talk this afternoon as well. Go on.
Okay, thank you. At first, I would like to thank the host to hold this meeting at such a nice city. And also, we can see kind of emergency for the climate change, because if the sea level is higher in the future, so the next city will maybe become smaller in the future. Yeah. And also, for our side, I would like to ask maybe a specific questions, such as the power interconnection between the Europe, such as especially for Italy and between the South Africa. And from the point of view of finance, I think could we tell what is the main barrier for such kind of power interconnection get finance, and such as the technical issues or the policy issues or some kind of maybe such other issues.
The main barrier for what?
For the power connection between Europe and South Africa to get financed, to get maybe a lower price of finance. So that's my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll ask Yimbo to respond to that first, but then maybe some of our finance people too.
I guess what you mean is actually from Europe to North Africa, but not South Africa, right?
Yeah, that's nice.
For me, actually, it's a question I would like to ask other panelists as well, because I'm not an expert about finance. But for me, it's actually the infrastructure construction within the country is easier. And even the intercontinental construction is easier because we have PCI projects in EU, we have the Asia Development Bank, we have Inter-America Development Bank. But when we're talking about the cross-continental projects, it's very hard to find very good financial supporters. So that's why I just said we have to make a very successful business model. We have to find a very good market for some projects like Great Inga. Once we have the market, once we have the successful business model, then we can, talking about the financial support. This investor only interested in the ROI, the return of the investment. So we are not just talking about idea, as I mentioned. We are also want to bring it into a very successful business model. That's what we are trying to do. We have a special group which is taking charge of the research work about this. We are doing the feasibility studies for some special areas like Mediterranean interconnection. So I think we cannot say for the whole world what we can do, but we have to say for some specific projects, we have to find specific investors.
So I think this is an important point again. It's that balance between having the global vision, global principles, and also having the specific manifestation. I wanted to add an extra point there. I've written down show it working, because especially to get investor confidence, but also to get investment from companies, if you can show something in action, that changes everything. This is something that we found in work on carbon capture and storage as well, that show it's real, and then it becomes something that gets back onto the table again. Colin.
Minor comment on that, related to what Leo said, that there was actually a solar company in Israel which did a review of what makes people put solar panels on their roof. And I don't know if anyone can guess here, but it's not the price, it's not being environmentally aware or anything. The main reason is if your neighbor has one on their roof. And so what the company did is they put 20 solar panels, and they paid for it, put it on the people's roofs, and their neighbors started to buy them up.
Absolutely. This is leadership and first follower. That's exactly it. Show it's happening, invest in that so that other people come along. I absolutely love that. We'll certainly come back to it. We have to draw this panel to a close now. We've got another opportunity to talk this afternoon when we're going to focus in on citizens. And of course, all of these things are connected. We've made a separation to make it a little bit easier, but the policy connects to the business, connects to the finance, connects to the citizens, and back again. And I think that's come out really clearly. I'm just going to ask again, each of you, just very, very briefly, just one dream to take away, one thing that you would really like to try and make happen if you could. Jérôme.
It's about leadership, and I think I will come back to the point I wanted to make, which is you have to find and to reward and praise the leaders of change. And I can tell you, OGCI was created in September 2014 at the UN Tribune in New York, thanks to 3 leaders. Georg, he was the head of the Global Compact. At this time, oil and gas companies were those to destroy the enemies. And Georg dared to, I would say, open the door and give a floor to oil and gas companies to create an initiative on climate. And he had that courage. Nobody else had it. And together with Georg, at the same time, Christiana Figueres, on the same thing. She understood, ahead of COP21, that antagonizing, opposing civil society, corporates, governments would bring us to a defeat. And that we had to have everybody together around the same table in a cooperation, in a positive cooperation, same as Georg. And the third one was bringing to the tribune the leader that you would not expect. You would be the last one to expect. And the one who came to the tribune to launch OGCI was the then CEO and chairman of Saudi Aramco, the Saudis, Khaled Al-Faleh. So the paradox. And so it's always thanks to leaders and big signals you send. So thanks to you, Georg, and to Christiana and Khaled Al-Faleh. I mean, that's a very important point.
Great, thank you. Bjørn.
Yeah, so I mean, last year the CO2 emission continued to rise, and we need to cut it into half in 11 years from now. So I mean, I think, you know, from my side, what I would like the business sector to do even more is obviously to work on solutions, but also to use their voice. That is for individual leaders, that is for individual companies, but also for companies going together to use their voice. Because obviously, like we learned yesterday, the awareness is still not high enough on the agenda, the urgency we need to act. So that is leadership, but that is more than leadership. That is leadership in an era of quick transformation, almost like a revolution. And we can all contribute. We can all be an influencer. And secondly, as a business sector, also to help to take this dialogue out from the conference room, from the boardrooms, out to the rest of the society. I think there we can do a lot, all of us, also coming back from this conference, to bring this dialogue further, because everybody needs to be involved. And I think a clear voice from business is important. Connie Hedegaard also mentioned that also influences policymakers. So sure. Business sector, we need to use our voice even stronger going forward, and we need to provide technology and solutions.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. We'll come back to that definitely at the end. We need to use our voice. We all need to use our individual voices, and businesses need to use their collective voice much more strongly. Thank you. Leo?
Yeah, just a reflection on what I'm feeling at the moment. I really appreciate Jérôme's reminder that 80% of oil and gas is not subject to shareholder resolutions. This is really, really important, and some of the practices in those NOCs are not best in class with regard to flaring, CO2 emissions, methane fugitive emissions, and so on. So the kind of leadership that's going to be required to enlist their engagement is absolutely critical to this. And it's very important that for those that are committed today to look to find ways for further engagement.
Yeah, thank you. Rebecca?
Just a real increase in data transparency, I think, is something that I would hope for in the future. So obviously we need to make lots of targets and reduce our emissions, but we need to know where we're starting from. So making it really public what companies are actually doing today so that we can check in and see if they're actually following their targets, if they're reducing their emissions. And I think that also helps along with the narrative. So you can, if you know what you're doing, you can tell people that you're the one doing the best. So, yeah, that's
thanks.
what I would push for.
One comment about that is I keep on hearing from companies, we don't want to be transparent, we'll get attacked if it's shown what we're doing. We have to kind of hide it because we don't want to be attacked. And the power of the narrative that says, look, we see where we are and look how we're improving. And this is our intention we'll come back next year and show you how we've improved and show you. And the power of that as a positive narrative, I think, can be really important.
Yeah,
Herman?
I would echo the narrative. I think we need to craft an appealing narrative with a clear purpose. Because if you look how the current climate is in terms of polarization, and people don't talk with each other, but along each other. And so if we're not able to have a meaningful, powerful narrative and actually engage with stakeholders in a dialogue, instead of what we do now, we won't be able to solve anything.
Brilliant, thank you. Heidi?
I want to invite all the companies in the room and also beyond to join the Global Compact and bring your solutions and innovations with you. We are leading, and we have the mandate from the Secretary General to lead on business innovation and ambition in the lead up to the Secretary General's Summit. And there's some good opportunities to showcase some of the leadership that we've discussed here on the 23rd of September in New York. So that's a very short-term vision.
Great, that's an immediate call to action. Great, you heard it here.
So at the last, I just want to highlight that actually decarbonization is not just the goal we're pursuing too, but actually it could be a very good business model. That's what GEIDCO and its members are doing. We're always trying to find the best business chances for the interconnection power projects actually, and we think we need more collaboration. I think by our platform we can do better. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Colin?
So many people talk about decentralization of the energy sector, and I think we can do the same with the solutions, to decentralize the solutions to support small businesses, startup companies, not the big corporations only finding the solutions. And I think we need to have a lot of faith in the younger generation. I think they're going to find the solutions for us for the problems that we caused.
Great. I'm not sure it should all be on their shoulders, but on that fine note, we will be talking about engaging citizens, particularly after lunch, but we're going to stop now and come back at 2:30 for our next panel. But first of all, thank you very much again. Fantastic ideas and approaches. So 2:30.